Bonjour, French 2 students. Here is a teaching lesson for the French 1 review over Unit 3. So Unit 3, really remember, is where the grammar portion of your textbook began. And so the first thing that you learned were the subject pronouns. So remember, these are how sentences start. And so we have the subject pronouns. S'il vous plaît, répétez je, tu, il, elle, nous, vous, il, elle. Couple things remember on this line. Remember, this is the first person. This line is the second person. And these two here are the third person. So when you're talking in language arts class and you're asked to write something in first person or second person or third person, it corresponds to these subject pronouns. So hopefully remember what these mean. Remember that je is the subject pronoun for I. Tu is the subject pronoun that means you. Il means he. Elle means, let's get it right, Elle. Elle means she. Remember what these have in common? These are singular, meaning you're only talking about one person. Nous means we. Vous means you as well. Il means they. And elle also means they. So let's talk first about the second person, the tu and the vous, because they both mean you. So what's the difference between these? Remember, this is what we call the informal or familiar you, while vous is the formal. Okay, vous. So what that means is, remember, vous is a little bit weird because this vous can be both singular, in which case it's being formal, or it can be plural. Okay, so and again, remember, all of these, for the most part, these subject pronouns are plural. Vous is the only one here that can sometimes be singular. And remember the difference between familiar versus formal. So informal or familiar means that we're using it with people we know, people who are younger than us, members of our family. When we're using this vous in a singular form for formal, again, we're using it with adults. Oops. Okay. And people you don't know. So people you don't know well. So a stranger on the street you would use the vous form with. Let's talk about the il pluriel and the elle pluriel, so the two forms of they. Remember, this il is for an all male or all masculine or a mixed group. The elle pluriel, okay, has to be all female. So even if there happens to be 99 girls and one boy, then you would have to use the il pluriel. You can only use the elle pluriel if the group is all female. The other thing to remember is that this je, okay, becomes J apostrophe before a vowel or a silent H. Okay. So, s'il vous plaît, répétez je, tu, il, elle, nous, vous, il, elle. So after learning the subject pronouns, the very first thing you learned was an irregular verb. Remember, irregular means that you have to memorize the verb. Remember that you learned the verb être, which means to be. It was the first verb you learned because it is the most common verb in both French and English. So this is definitely a verb you're going to need to remember how to conjugate. In French 2A, remember conjugate means you're making your subject and verb agree. Okay, so what we're going to do here, this is called a conjugation chart. And again, what we're going to do here is we're going to put in the forms of the verb être. So hopefully remember these forms. Again, if you don't, you need to remember them. You might want to make yourself flashcards. So for être, it's je suis, tu es, il, elle singular, est, nous sommes, vous êtes, and il and elle pluriel sont. So again, this is the verb être. S'il vous plaît, répétez je suis, tu es, il est, elle est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont, elles sont. And then there was an expression in your book about être d'accord, which is how you say you agree or disagree with something. Next up were about 3 ways to ask yes or no questions. Remember when we talk about yes or no, that just means that the question could be answered with simply a yes or a no. Remember in French, because you're learning to write it, I really want you to answer those questions with more than just a oui or no. I want you to write a complete sentence. But there were 3 ways to ask yes or no questions, and 2 of the ways you had seen in units 1 and 2 of your textbook. Okay, so there were simple ways that you had already been asking questions, and then you were kind of introduced to a new one. So that simple way that you had been asking questions was basically you took a sentence and you add a question mark at the end, and you raise your voice. So for example, you had asked a question like, tu as femme. Okay. It was a simple way to ask questions, but not a very good way. Because if you don't remember to raise your voice, like I just did, right? Tu as femme, you don't know whether it's a question or a statement. Because this really is asking with a question mark, are you hungry? But if it doesn't have a question mark, it's just saying you are hungry. So, the best way that you learned was to add est-ce que at the beginning of your sentence. Now you did have to remember that est-ce que, the que part becomes Q-U apostrophe before a vowel or a silent H. But this was, this is our best way to ask questions. So, an example, if I just take that same tu as femme and I use the est-ce que at the beginning, it becomes, est-ce que to a femme. And again, what's better about this as a question is that the est-ce automatically tells whomever you're speaking to that this is a question. So that was the best way you were going to ask questions. The third way was that you could put n'est-ce pas at the end. So if you took that to a femme question, then it would be to a femme, n'est-ce pas? But again, the way that we want to be doing this is way number 2. Okay, that's the best way to be asking questions, and moving forward into French 2, that is the way you should be asking questions. Now remember, it's easy to answer these affirmatively, right? Because to answer affirmatively, then we would just say, in this case, oui, j'ai femme. Okay? But the bigger issue was, how do you answer these negatively? And to be able to answer a question in a negative way, you need more than just no, because again, I want you to answer them in complete sentences. So, to answer a question in the negative, the format is our subject, ne, verb, pas. And again, we want to remember that ne becomes an apostrophe before a vowel or a silent H. So, for example, if I want to say that no, I'm not hungry, it'd be no, je n'ai pas faim. Okay, so again, just kind of reviewing 3 easy ways to ask yes or no questions, and then how you can answer those questions negatively by using that ne and pas. So you had learned the irregular verb être, which was the most commonly used verb in French, and you had to memorize it. But remember, when we get into regular verbs, okay, instead of having to memorize, you just have to remember the pattern. And so for regular ER verbs, we're going to start with what's called our infinitive. And we're going to subtract or remove the ER, which gives us our stem. And to the stem, we add depending upon the subject of the sentence. If the subject of our sentence is je, we're going to add an E to our stem. If the subject of our sentence is to, we're going to add an ES to our stem. If the subject of our sentence is il or L, or remember one person's name, okay, then we're going to add an E to our stem. If the subject of our sentence is nous, we're going to add ONS. If the subject of our sentence is vous, it's going to be EZ. And if the subject of our sentence is il pluriel, L pluriel, or multiple people's names, we're going to add ENT. So, for example, okay, if we look at the verb écouter, écouter means to listen. So I'm going to put together a conjugation chart for écouter, right? So it's J apostrophe because écouter starts with a vowel. So remember that J apostrophe or je becomes J apostrophe. So my stem is the ECOUT because I've lost my ER to get my stem, and now I'm going to add an E. For to ECOUT, that's my stem, I add an ES. For eel or L singular, E-C-O-U-T, that's my stem, I add an E. For new, E-C-O-U-T, and I add my O-N-S. For VOO, E-C-O-U-T, that's my stem, I add my E-Z. And for eel, an L pluriel, E-C-O-U-T, and I add my E-N-T. Now, pronouncing these, you do need to remember how to pronounce them. Remember that there are 3 different pronunciations. So the ones in the boot, the verbs all sound the same, right? So these all sound the same. And then remember the infinitive and the VOO form sound the same. So we have 3 pronunciations, and you should be able to pronounce, okay, you should be able to pronounce any regular ER verb. So, s'il vous plaît, répétez écouter, j'écoute, tu écoutes, elle écoute, nous écoutons, vous écoutez, ils écoutent. Now, one little aside, remember for new verbs that are in GER, so that's manger and nager and voyager, those verbs and their infinitive end in a GER. In the new form, you're going to add EONS when you conjugate them. So again, those were your regular ER verbs, and because you just had a pattern, then you could conjugate all of these new verbs in Unit 3, because they all follow this pattern. S'il vous plaît, répétez aimer, chanter, danser, dîner, dîner au restaurant, écouter, écouter la radio, étudier, habiter, inviter, jouer au basket, jouer au foot, jouer au tennis, jouer aux jeux vidéo, manger, nager, organiser une boum, parler anglais, parler espagnol, parler français, regarder, regarder la télé, téléphoner, travailler, visiter, voyager. So all of these verbs follow this regular ER verb pattern. So if you learn the pattern, which you need to remember again, you can conjugate any of these verbs. So the next thing was that sometimes we have 2 verbs in one sentence, in which case the first verb is always conjugated. Remember, conjugated means made to match the subject. And the second verb is in its infinitive. Remember, all of these are all infinitives. Okay, so these are those verbs in that infinitive form. So for example, if I want to say that they, a group of girls, like to eat pizza. So my subject for they is either il pluriel or elle pluriel, and because this is girls, it's going to be elle. The verb for to like is aimer. So again, this is my infinitive, but I need to make it match. So my stem part is aim, and because it's elle pluriel, I'm going to add an ent. That's my first verb. It's conjugated. Now, to eat is another verb, right? To eat is manger. So I'm going to use that verb in its infinitive form. And we're going to say une pizza. To say this, it would be elles aiment manger une pizza. So this is true when you have two verbs in your sentence. In your book, there are some starters for you. There was je préfère, je voudrais, je veux, or je ne veux pas. Est-ce que tu veux? Je peux, je ne peux pas, and je dois, as verbs that were already conjugated, and so your second verb would be in the infinitive. So next we came to information questions. It's nice to be able to ask yes or no questions. However, you can't really ask for information that way. So we're going to talk about the format of information questions, and hopefully you remember that the format of information questions is question word, est-ce que, okay, our subject, and then our verb. So this also works for when we're talking about yes or no questions, because the only difference when we have a yes or no question is this doesn't exist. There's no question word. In a yes or no question. Okay, so this format for questions works whether we're talking about information questions or not. The only difference is if we're asking a yes or no question, there's not a question word, but it's still est-ce que, our subject, our verb, right? So again, for subjects, we're talking about the je, tu, il, elle, nous, vous, il, elle, okay? Again, it could also be people's names, but we're talking about those subjects. And again, our verb, we still have to conjugate it. So we still have to make our verb match whatever the subject of our sentence is. So to be able to ask information questions then, it's pretty important you remember those question words. So those question words, okay, these again are something you need to know, because this is going to come up all the time in the listening portion of lesson quizzes and on your unit test. They're going to ask a question and give you several possible answers as choices, and you need to decide which answer makes sense. Well, to decide which answer makes sense, you have to know what the question was, and usually that is dependent upon knowing what the question word is. So the question word for who or whom is qui. To whom, so we add the word for to or at, which is a. So it's a qui. About or from whom, again, the word for about or from is de. So this is de qui. With whom is the word with, which is avec. Qui. For whom, usually this is everybody's favorite. For is pour. And then qui. The question word for what is que. The question word for when is cold. Where is où? Why is pourquoi? And how is como? And at what time is à quelle heure? One thing to remember about que, because the next word is esque and starts with a vowel, this becomes qu'est-ce. When it's a question. So, s'il vous plaît, répétez qui, à qui, de qui, avec qui, pour qui, que, or qu'est-ce que, quand, où, pourquoi, comment, à quelle heure. So, using those question words allows you to ask all these information questions. The other thing to remember about this que, this is one of those little words that along with je and ne and que, all of these lose their E and get an apostrophe before a vowel or a silent H. So when our subject is il, it becomes qu'il. Qu'il, for L it's quel. So knowing the format of these information questions and these question words, you're able to ask for lots more information. Now, this question, this format where we use question word, esque, subject, verb, we refer to that as the long way. We also had a short way. And that short way, okay, was when we ask questions using subject, verb, inversion. And basically in subject, verb, inversion, you do exactly what it sounds like. Inversion means to reverse. And we're going to reverse the order of the subject and the verb. So remember, over here, our subject comes first and our verb comes second. In subject, verb, inversion, we're going to reverse that order. So the format of a subject, verb, inversion question, or the question the short way, is remember we're going to leave out the esque, and we're going to reverse the order of the subject and the verb. So our format is, our question word is still there if it's an information question. So that is still there. We're going to leave out the esque, and we're going to reverse the order of the subject and the verb. So next comes our verb. We use a hyphen between them, our subject, and then again, kind of our dot, dot, dot for whatever else is in that question. When this verb and this subject both start with vowels, we have to put a T between them. So then we're going to do hyphen T hyphen. So if we take an example, so the question, où est-ce que vous habitez? Hopefully you can figure out what that question is asking, right? Où is where. Vous is you, plural, and habiter is the verb habiter, which means to live. So this is asking, where do you live? So to take this to subject, verb, inversion, again, this part is going to get left out, and we're going to reverse the order of these. So our question in subject verb inversion is où habitez-vous? Now, again, as French 2 students, you should be asking questions more frequently using the short way with subject verb inversion rather than the long way, because you're more sophisticated students. And especially if you're thinking about continuing into French 3 as an independent study at some point, you need to really be able to ask questions using subject verb inversion. So from here on out in class, you are welcome to write questions whichever way you prefer. This short way or this long way. All right, that brings us to another irregular verb. Remember, that means it's one that you need to memorize. And faire means to do or to make. And the forms of faire are je fais, tu fais, il or elle fait. It's pronounced the same, but it ends with a T. Nous faisons, vous faites, and il and elle pluriel font. S'il vous plaît, notez faire, je fais, tu fais, il fait, nous faisons, vous faites, elles font. And again, there are 4 expressions here that use faire. These are expressions in English that don't use the verb to do or to make, but in French they do. S'il vous plaît, notez faire un match, faire une promenade, faire un voyage, faire attention. So that brings us to the end of Unit 3. I hope that helped you remember, and by making and filling out this French 1 review, you do have a little cheat sheet, if you will, of having all of that information in one spot. Au revoir, à demain.